So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to continue kind of our discernment, our reminder around just kind of the bones, the structure of who we are as a community with Wayfarers. So, we will kind of be working our way out of the circle. We started the first week with worship and how that's worship and connection with God is just absolutely central to who we are and what we do. We moved into service, the fact that paying attention to others and serving them well is a huge part of living a good life. And this week, we are kind of looking at our own personal places of hospitality. So I don't think it's much of a secret that in our culture people tend to be really lonely. There's been so many sociological studies on just kind of many of the breakdown of the kind of traditional things that people use to be around one another for community. And that includes churches, which I think in the last 100 years in America, one of their main functions has been a social and community building one. And so I think particularly post COVID, in which people were forced at various levels to be very isolated from one another, I think the idea of community and actually becoming involved in one's life is a pretty intimidating thing in our culture right now. And I think our bread and butter as a community has always been about being hospitable and having people into our homes. But I think the need is more dire than it's probably ever been since this community existed. Right now, people are more isolated and lonely, I think, than they've been in a long time. And we've got kind of that additional difficulty of the discomfort of being around one another. Some of it is just physical fear and making sure that we continue to stay healthy. Some people, have had very different experiences of the pandemic. And some people have just gotten out of the habit. It was hard enough convincing people to invite people into their homes or to go to somebody else's home on a regular basis before the pandemic, and I think it's even more difficult right now. So, yeah, the deck feels a little bit stacked right now, but the deck is often stacked kind of culturally against the kingdom of God, and it has not slowed God's work down before, and I don't think it will now. So let me talk about what I mean by his hospitality in our culture. I'm sorry, in our community. For us, hospitality is more than simply sharing meals, although it is that too. Like the apostles, we have to share our lives, and especially the messy parts. But there's also a mutuality here. They get to bless us and share their lives with us too. At times, we've called this a threshold space as well. The gospel needs to be lived. People need access to our lives to see it. So, when I'm talking hospitality, I don't just mean inviting people over. Should we be eating meals with people on a regular basis? I think absolutely. I think the just celebratory aspect of sharing meals with people all the time is super important. It's very unusual in our culture, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so important. It actually preparing meals for people is one of the simplest ways to tell people that they are valuable, that they are worth our time. Now, I think that this is something that can be difficult to do because we are so busy as a culture, right? We're so used to having people over. It's kind of this planned event. It takes us, weeks and months a lot of the time to get somebody on the calendar and all that. And I think because of that, we have a bit of a kind of event planner's mindset. We know our houses are generally kind of a mess, and for some reason, we feel like that reflects poorly on us. We need to clean things up and make sure the food is all right. And it takes a lot of extra effort. It takes a lot of extra effort to make um, our houses and our lives and our food and everything else look spick and span enough that we feel comfortable inviting people over. And then, interestingly, when we go into those houses, so much of the time, we feel intimidated, like, oh, this isn't what my house is like. These people must be perfect, right? These people have it all together, and we feel embarrassed. And then we feel like if we ever have them over again, we need to do the same. We need to make sure we clean up our lives. And so, our kind of advice as a community is you should have people around so often, or get in the habit of doing this often enough that you just don't have time or feel the need to kind of clean things up. Does that mean a total wreck is more inviting, not necessarily, but if you live in this space, if you can be at home and comfort there, probably other people can too. Will they recognize that you're not perfect? Probably, but that's what people are more interested in. And so, I think that is a symbol of the way we tend to present our lives to one another. We kind of curate this image, whether it's on social media or even in the conversations we have with people. We tend to kind of project a certain image, a way of being thought of. And some of that's just how we wish we could be and think of ourselves. And some of it's we want to be more likable, more lovable. And we think that kind of spiffing up our lives and hiding our flaws, etc., is the way to make ourselves more lovable, more likable. And so I think a huge chunk of his hospitality, a huge chunk of actually understanding what Jesus is trying to teach us about the kingdom and the gospel is not doing that, is knowing that there are good and beautiful things in our lives and that there are flaws and things that we probably need to grow out of, right? And I think rather than that intimidating people and people thinking, oh, well, they're kind of a mess or whatever, and oh, I don't want to be around them, I've found that people tend to enjoy us for our flaws. People tend to kind of know who we are and actually respect us more when we present just human beings with some good and beautiful things about us and some hard and not so beautiful things about our lives. And so hospitality again is inviting people to be around you often enough to see you in enough different situations, in situations when you're killing it, you're doing really well, and in situations when you're not, when you feel out of your league, when you're uncomfortable, where you're grumpy. um, the goal is to break down these kind of isolated lives we live with hospitality. And some of the simplest ways to do that is, of course, our meals and our home. I want to show just kind of an illustration that, again, we mentioned in this definition that this is what the apostles used to do. This is not a new thing for the Christian church. It's not a new thing for most of the world church either. This is very normal and common in many other places. It's just a little less common in kind of our isolated assumptions as a culture. Out of the book of First Thessalonians, we get kind of a description of what this looks like from the Apostle Paul. And I think descriptions like this are easy to kind of breeze over, but they're also really, really important because it's a reminder that the epistles, these books that we have in the Bible, are actually letters. Yes, they include a lot of theology. Yes, they include a lot of doctrine and important thinking about the Bible and the world, but they were letters among groups of people who had shared their lives, and they were having this often intense discussion about following God well and what the kingdom means for them in the context of shared lives, of having a lot of meals together, of being near one another. And so we get this description in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 from Paul. As you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, our visit with you wasn't a waste of time. On the contrary, we had the courage, through God, to speak God's good news in spite of a lot of opposition. Our appeal isn't based on false information, the wrong motives, or deception. Rather, we have been examined and approved by God to be trusted with the good news, and that's exactly how we speak. We aren't trying to please people, but we are trying to please God, who continues to examine our hearts. As you know, we never used flattery, and as God is our witness, we didn't have greedy motives. We didn't ask for special treatment from people, not from you or from others, although we could have thrown our weight around as Christ's apostles. Instead, you were gentle with you like a nursing mother caring for her own children. We were glad to share not only God's good news with you, but also our very lives because we cared for you so much. We appealed to you, we encouraged you, we pleaded with you to live lives worthy of the God who is calling you into his own kingdom and his own glory. I think it's just a really beautiful description of not just spirituality as kind of like a churchiness, as an abstract, out of lives in which God's presence and spirituality is being expressed really well. Can they exhort one another? Can they encourage one another? Can they learn these things together They absolutely can because there's a lot of hospitality. They have shared meals together, they've taken care of one another, they have suffered together much of the time, and that's an important part of life together as well, right? There's a lot that is hard out there. And we were not meant to walk through those things on our own. We were meant to bear one another. We were meant to carry one another as best we can when things are hard and when we are feeling heavy. And in a culture where I think it's hard to have conversations without feeling like somebody's selling something, right? They want you to be all about their thing, or sometimes they literally want you to buy whatever it is that they're all about. I think this is an antidote, a possibility of just reminding, like, you know what, there are no greedy motives. All I'm getting out of this is the sheer joy of a life well lived, of a life that is about community following Jesus and another way of being in the world. So we kind of talked about, the very core of this community is worship and connection with God. But the two most natural ways that that is going to be expressed as we move our way out are, of course, in service, literal taking care of other people in any way we can, and of course in hospitality, inviting them back into our lives and being mutually blessed when they invite us into theirs. So yeah, hospitality is very much at the core of what we do here. We think hospitality in of itself is spiritual, not as a way of tricking people or getting at it. Just that that's the way Jesus lived, and that's the way we want to live as well here at Wayfarers Chapel.